My name is Emerson, and I doubt my Christian faith. Throughout my life, I've been faced with deep, unanswered questions about the world I've been raised into. Being raised as an evangelical, a movement of conservative Protestants, the focus of many of these questions have been regarding my religious worldview. I saw double standards, paradoxes, and what I consider to be cognitive dissonance, evident in sermons, biblical narratives, and the wise sayings from my fellow Christians. I believe that there are many Christians, or now non-believers, like me, afraid to share their concerns for fear of rejection or to explore their misgivings further with the potentiality of disproving their own religious worldview. I must admit I share many of these feelings. Friends, family, and historic significant others have had issue with my inability to blindly accept preached narratives about Christianity. A pastor in my life had previously asked me to lead a devotional group to support fellow doubters that would seek to answer questions of faith together within the confines of the church. At this time, however, I've resolved that the church, or participating in its institutional groupings, will not bring me fulfillment or peace. Instead, I've decided to explore these topics from my naive perspective on YouTube, through a lens and understanding that makes sense to me. I would like to invite you to join with me, and I hope that this channel and this YouTube video can serve as a safe place for you to both reflect on your own views and help me along in my personal journey. This video is in part a response to a sermon that I watched at Encounter Church, based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The title of the sermon is God's Will for Your Life, and it explores the belief that God lovingly has planned our lives specifically to have a purpose within His divine will. Personally, I have found that this proposition troubles me greatly, and I set out to explore why that is. I discovered that my reasoning lies in the belief that if God truly has a planned existence for me, I cannot simultaneously believe that God truly loves me. This narrative of God's will and love is very common in the church, and I've found it problematic for some time. As a child of divorce, I've never been able to bring myself to believe that God willed my father to leave my family, nor accept that He destined my childhood and young adult life to be hampered by significant financial difficulties. Because if God truly loved me, why would He design my childhood to entail the purposeless emotional trauma of my family collapsing? How could God be somehow both sovereign in bringing these things to pass and still love me?
And so what we want to do this morning is to say that God actually, number one, has a plan, a specific plan and a purpose for your life. So we're going to open up the Bible. We're going to go to the book of Proverbs, this wisdom literature kind of book, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. And let me read that for you now. Proverbs 3, 5 and 6 says that trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. It's God's sovereign will. Technically, the sovereign will of God is defined by the will of God that brings to pass whatsoever He decrees. In other words, the sovereign will of God is just simply what happens. Is everything that happened because it's God's sovereign will. You can pick up a history book, you can remember a story, all of that happened was God's sovereign will. And what could be more comforting and peace assuring in a time of a traveler is to have somebody say, listen, He's going to make these paths. Every road that you walk down, it's going to be straight, it's going to be clear, it's going to be obvious, it's going to be intuitive. You'll just know. I mean, that sounds good to us today, especially as it relates to like God's will. You know, one of the things that's murky about God's will, confusing about God's will, is that we look at God's will overall and we say, okay, I know God is big. I know he's strong. I know God is all-powerful. I also know that God is good. I believe that he is. So if he's all-powerful and he's all good, why do all kinds of bad things happen in the world? I just don't get it. Where's God's will in that? He's a God that meticulously dabbles in the details of life, yet so much of life, huge questions of life just seem radically open to us.
You're welcome to pause the video and watch the remainder of that sermon if you'd like further context, but honestly, it's not necessary for this conversation. While I'm not disagreeing with the sermon itself, I do take issue with the fact that Pastor Dirk speaks of the world's suffering and then doesn't properly address the tension that he highlights. Suffering exists within God's purpose that he wants for us. Specifically, Pastor Dirk makes three principal claims in his sermon that, when held simultaneously, could not coincide harmoniously. First, he claims that God has a specific plan for your life. He then proceeds by stating that God is fully sovereign, depicting God as having complete control over every instant, and that only God's purposed events will transpire at his determined place and time. While holding these statements to be true, Dirk also adds that it is not within God's nature to plan for his creation to suffer. Rather, that God is good, and his plan is also good. Perhaps God may use some negative experiences for a good, broader purpose, but coordinating the meaningless suffering of his creation would go against his character. God's disdain for suffering is a central belief of Christianity, as God's goodness cannot coincide with evil, and that in God loving us and designing our existence, he just doesn't want us to be in pain. The cognitive dissonance that I find evident within these aforementioned claims is that in God having a plan for your life, his plan includes both good and bad eventualities. This is essentially the philosophical problem of evil. Christians throughout the history of our religion have continuously wrestled with this conflict, and I cannot see how you can hold these premises to all be true simultaneously. Yet, that is what we're taught to believe as Christians. Pastors like Dirk preach sermons with these claims, but forgo to explain that God's life for us as a species is fraught with purposeless suffering, and it therefore must be in his plan somehow. The grievances that humans commit against one another are evidence of this fact, be it slavery, war, or the monstrosities that plague our society like the Holocaust. It is surely easy for a pastor in Middle America to say that God is sovereign in all things, while their congregation pays their salary and they feel so far away from the Muslim minority in China being carted away in trains to re-education camps, and even the suffering of America's unwanted children as they reside in the broken foster care system. Quoting Proverbs 3:5-7 to the people suffering from natural disasters that take lives and livelihoods will not provide the peace that Dirk implies that it should. Let me explain where the cognitive dissonance of this matter truly occurs. If you were to believe that claims 1 and 2 are absolutely true, that God truly is sovereign as defined by Pastor Dirk previously, and God plans our lives, we must also accept that God's will includes purposeless suffering, thereby rejecting claim number 3. Yet Christians will not accept that God's plan includes suffering and attempt to circumnavigate the issue entirely. And honestly, I understand their reasoning for doing so. The deflection that I've heard in my lifetime is that God only allows for suffering. He does not directly cause it. However, that belief would then be in direct opposition to claim number 2, because it redefines God's sovereignty. Essentially, if you assume that God allows for suffering, or instead resolve that premise 3 is also non-negotiable truth, then the result is that you must reject premise 2, because you would be redefining sovereignty entirely. This action is not an option before us, as any other definition is not taught by the church and is not commonly viewed as biblical. In other words, believing that God does not plan for our suffering means that you must reject his sovereignty or redefine it, which both would be potentially heretical. Even with these complications, our plight isn't even considering the implication that God's direct sovereignty and pre-designed plan would have a direct impact on our ability to choose things freely. That God does not allow us the opportunity to choose him, and instead selects those who are lucky to go to heaven and to be with him. Given our terms and premises, it seems that we are at an impasse, wherein our worldview cannot withstand its own contradictions. This impasse will not let me out of its psychological grip. Every time I hear one of these statements in a sermon or conversation with a fellow Christian, it results in my mental retreat, because I cannot make sense of this dichotomy and feel that I must deny my faith due to dissonance. I think that I have found some solace in creating this video, but I would be more at peace if I was to have a clear way to quell my anxious questioning with resolution. Sharing my attempt at doing so may be for another day. And until that time comes, I encourage you to reflect on this example of Christianity's cognitive dissonance and perhaps look for others in your personal faith that you may have never thought about before. You may be able to hear it in my voice, but this is one of the many things that keeps me up.